Gresham College presents Is Shakespeare Still Our Contemporary? By Professor Jan Kott, Gresham Professor of Rhetoric.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. As you know, I am originally from Poland. I spent almost 21 years in America, United States. And of course my English is still very much Polish, or rather Scottish, than English. And it's an old joke, who is an emigre? An emigre is a man who lost everything except his accent. That you have a good example of an emigre. The scene or the stage is finally on the British Channel, on the island of Greenwich, of Guernsey or of Jersey. There are two men sitting on the balcony of the little inn looking to the ocean. One is the old man, the second one is his son, in his 25 years old. It's the beginning of the winter, very stormy weather. Now the young man, the son, asked his father, "Heb pan studies at exil? What you are thinking of this exile?" The answer is, "I guess it will last a long time." Silence. Now the second question, "What you are thinking to do here?" The father say, "I will watch the ocean." Silence. After the silence, the old man asked the young one, "What you will do here?" I will translate Shakespeare. It is the 50s of the 19th century. The old man is Victor Hugo. The young man is his son, who later was one of the best French translators of Shakespeare, very well known. Victor Hugo is on exile, sent to this small island by Napoleon in 51 or in 52. Now we can ask ourselves, what is the meaning of this scene? What is the meaning for our question, the contemporary Shakespeare? One can say that Shakespeare is always a contemporary one. But one can say also that, as in Orwell's Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than the others. That is same with Shakespeare. Sometimes Shakespeare is more contemporary than in the other time. And of course, if Shakespeare was the contemporary one, was for the first time, in a very strong way, the contemporary to the generation of the Romantic poets. Now going back to this scene is the ocean. The ocean is of course timeless. But we have here another time, a time of the exile. And it seems to me quite important that this vision of Shakespeare as the contemporary one was from the perspective of the exile. Few years before, or in the 30s, the impact of Shakespeare on the French literature or the French theater was extremely big, especially for Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo, in his famous introduction to his drama Cromwell, in the late 20s, wrote, "Melpomene, the muse of the drama, as she called herself, is frightened when she is touching a real history. He is leading to the theatrical tailor. Now we'll call him a stage designer or a costume designer. He is leading to the theatrical tailor all the care of the time and place of the drama. History has in her eyes a bad taste. A real history is disgusting. How is possible, for example, to tolerate on the tragic scene the kings who curse like the coachman, or the queens who behave like the fishwives? And once again, 2 or 3 years later, the Shakespeare was evoked even in a more clear way, and Victor Hugo wrote, Shakespeare in one blast shows and evokes the grotesque and the sublime, the monstrous and the pathetic, the tragedy and the comedy. Everything which is in the nature has its place in the art. Of course, we see quite well that here Shakespeare is a contemporary against someone else. Shakespeare is the contemporary one for this generation of Victor Hugo, of Gautier, of Alfred de Musset, of the others, because Racine and the classical tradition of the French stage is the old one, is not the contemporary one. And this seems to me very important because in this notion to be a contemporary one or not to be still or not to be still, you have always 2 times. You have a time on stage and you have a time of the audience. Sometimes it's the same time, sometimes it's different time. Now I would like to quote from Hamlet. It's extremely well-known quotation. Hamlet is saying to the actors, let them be well used, for they are the abstracts and brief chronicles of the time. But what time? It is our time, it is their time, and it seems to me that in these rare moments when Shakespeare is really the contemporary one, the time on stage and the time off stage, the time of the audience and the time of the actors is the same time, or to use the modern vision of the Russian scholar of the carnival tradition, is the time of the city, of the Chitta, the time of the marketplace. They are finally three bodies of Shakespeare. As the great British scholar, the late T.B. Spencer, once said, Shakespeare's bodies are, one is the text. The text is also changing, especially in our time with all these visions that text is changing with the reader, with the deconstruction and construction, with the new reading. But anyway, the first body of the Shakespeare is the text of Shakespeare. It's of course Shakespeare to be read. The second body of Shakespeare is the Shakespeare Academy. It's Shakespeare for the dissertation, for the PhD thesis, for the exercises. Shakespeare to make the promotion, Shakespeare to receive the tenures and the honors. Shakespeare Academy. Shakespeare finally to be taught. It's finally a big profession of Shakespearean scholars. But the third body of Shakespeare, which seems to be always more contemporary than the others, is the Shakespeare on stage. Shakespeare to be performed. As once again, as Shakespeare said himself in The Tempest, the globe, the great globe itself. But the globe is the theater, the Shakespeare theater, but the great globe itself is also the planet. Of course, Shakespeare, when he is the contemporary one, is Shakespeare of this double meaning of the globe. Double meaning of the globe in which the theater is a reflection of life, or when we have this double mirror, the stage mirroring the audience mirroring the stage. And this double reflection, double influence is extremely important in this kind of the understanding of Shakespeare. Because, of course, Shakespeare influenced Victor Hugo and generation of the Romantic writers in France and in Germany. But on the other way, we have to understand that Victor Hugo and the other, they influenced Shakespeare. We have the double impact. The discovery of the Romantic Shakespeare, of Shakespeare by the Romantic generation changed the stage, changed the spectacle of Shakespeare. And we have this double influence. As later in our time, it was Shakespeare who influenced Brecht in some way, even Beckett. But on the other way, it's Beckett and Brecht who influenced Shakespeare on stage, who changed, especially in this country, the production in the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare. I can give you one example, maybe that is very obvious. Before the 30s, on the French stage, of Othello was performed in so-called the Ducis adaptation. Almost in the whole 18th century, all over Europe, Shakespeare was performed always in some kind of adaptation. On the British stage, on the English stage, also Shakespeare was adapted to the different tastes. Now, in this Othello on the French stage, there were two mutilations of Shakespeare's text. One, Desdemona had not lost her handkerchief. Handkerchief in French, the word for the handkerchief, is le mouchoir. Le mouchoir was judged indecent on the French tragic stage because it was a part of the women's lingerie, of the underwear. On the tragic stage, it was impossible to say le mouchoir. They changed the handkerchief of Desdemona into a diamond, into a diadem. It was one. The second change, which was also very characteristic, at the end, as we know, Othello strangles Desdemona. It is indecent. In the good families, the jealous husband can kill his wife by a dagger, but not to strangle. They change the murder, they change the whole scene. And it's not before 1831 that Othello was again translated by Misset, that more or less a proper text of Shakespeare was staged in the French theatre. This we see very well that the influence is always the influence going back and forth, between the staging with changing of time and the old tradition and the old text of Shakespeare. The best example is probably Hamlet. Because Hamlet is the greatest mirror. Hamlet is always in some way transparent. Hamlet, the play, Hamlet as character, once I wrote in my book, is like the Swiss cheese, because with the holes, in these holes the contemporary events, the contemporary features are coming and they pierce the old text of Hamlet. The best example is probably the very well-known statement of Goethe in Wilhelm Meister's Lehr Jahre, near the end of the 18th century. Goethe wrote on Hamlet, a lovely, pure, noble, and most moral nature, without the strength of nerve which forms a hero, sinks beneath a burden which it cannot bear and must not cast away. All duties are wholly for him. The present is too hard. The present, because this is the most important word here. What is the present? It's 1795. 1795 is more or less 3 years after the execution of the French king, 2 years after the execution of Robespierre, of Danton, 1 year later after the execution of Robespierre at the beginning of the Directoire in France. But what in Germany? In Germany, Germany was divided into 200 or 300 little states, dukedoms, with the little courts. the young Germans who had, let's say, 20 years, who were 20 years old during the French Revolution. They read Kant, they read Fichte, they are the idealists. They were too weak for the revolution, they were too weak for the murder. Forget the image of Hamlet. Hamlet is more or less like the young Germans, like the young idealist Germans of the generation of Kleist, of Hölderlin, and for the historians of drama who read and who appreciate Prince von Homburg, which is the greatest historical drama written by a German, by Kleist 10 years later, finally Prince von Homburg is also some kind of German Hamlet. We remember also a beautiful line on Hamlet by James Joyce in Ulysses, who wrote that, who evokes the affiche of the French stage from the 19th century, Hamlet ou le distrait. Hamlet, absent-minded, that in some way this German Prince von Homburg is also absent-minded Hamlet. Now if we compare this extremely well-known judgment of Hamlet by Goethe to another one by Brecht. By Brecht in the Little Organon. In the Little Organon it was written near the few years, 2 or 3 years after the World War II. 1948 or 1949, as far as I remember. This is a very curious statement, because Brecht starts that in our time of the war, we have to read the old play of Hamlet in a very different way. Fortinbras starts a predatory war against Poland. Hamlet meets young Fortinbras at the coast as he is marching with his troops to Poland. For anyone who read Hamlet, or for anyone who did the exercises of Hamlet with the students, with the kids, it's very strange, because I guess for the first time Poland is mentioned in this abstract of Hamlet. Who finally remember that it was the war by the young Fortinbras going through the territory of Denmark to Poland. But for Brecht, for the director of the drama, near the end and few years after the World War II, all this contemporary war, the place of Poland, was extremely important. It was a new reading of Hamlet. Overcome by this warrior-like example, Fortinbras, Hamlet turns back and in a piece of barbaric butchery slaughters his uncle, his mother, and himself, leaving Denmark to the Norwegian. It's also a completely different perspective, because finally in Hamlet we are doing with Hamlet the prince, with jealousy, with Ophelia, with Gertrude, with murder, but no one is finally before Brecht thinking that will be a change of the ruler in Denmark, that finally Denmark will be now on the rule of Fortinbras of Norwegian. And now we can see quite well that here the political perspective of Brecht, reading Hamlet, is the perspective of Yalta and of the division of Europe between on the East Europe under the occupation of Russia. And Brecht is ending his paragraph. These events show the young man, already somewhat stout, making the most ineffective use of the new approach to reason, which he has picked up at the University of Wittenberg. In the feudal business to which he returns, it simply hampers him. Faced with the irrational practices, his reason is utterly unpractical. He falls a tragic victim on the discrepancy between such reasoning and such action. It's very easy to see that it's not very far from Goethe to Brecht. It's the same, it's a split. It's a split within Hamlet, only the split is not a split within the character. It's, as Brecht used to say, a kind of the objective lesson, of the objective opposition. And the names for this objective opposition are the Wittenberg, the Center for the Humanities, and Elsinore, this feudal old place of the old rivalry drinking and feudal murders. It's the opposition between, in some way here, between the past and the present, but the result is not very far from Goethe's judgment, because Hamlet could not do it with the new reason, this new reason of the humanities, of the Wittenberg, in the feudal praxis of Elsinore, is unpractical. This seems to me very important, because when we watch Hamlet, a problem for the audience, and at the same time, a problem for the director and or the actors, is finally, if we are watching Elsinore from the perspective of Wittenberg, the center of the humanities, or we are watching Wittenberg from the perspective of the more or less barbarian Danish capital. Anyway, this opposition exists where we are as the audience. We are within Elsinore or we are far in Wittenberg. For Brecht was quite clear during the World War II that the place of the audience watching this old play of Hamlet is in Elsinore, not in this more or less mythic Wittenberg. Even more explicit this division is in the Russian film Hamlet, made by Kozintsev almost 22 years ago, almost at the same time as I wrote my book on Hamlet. It's a beautiful film, but when in this film we hear, as in a Shakespeare play, Denmark is a prison, we know that for the Russian audience, for this audience of the film, for anyone finally trying to understand the intention of the director, we are at Elsinore. We are at Elsinore with this marvelous image of Ophelia in the corset of steel, like in the cage of torture, the same cage of torture that was possible to see in the exposition of torture a few years ago in Rome. But even something are more explicit, because in the great hall in which Claudius and Gertrude received the ambassador, the envoys from the other states, we have a big statue, a very big statue of Claudius. For the Western or Western allies spectator, it's a strange that in the palace of Claudius we have a statue of Claudius. It's unusual. But for anyone who is adjust or anyway who had experience of the rooms and halls in Kremlin or in the other places in Russia, at this time, always there were two statues of Stalin and at least two statues of Lenin watching each other. And also Claudius played at the Russian film had the same kind of smile, this kind of smile as Stalin. This is very important because if we're asking ourselves, who is the contemporary one? Of course, for Goethe, the contemporary one was the young, weak Prince Hamlet. For Goethe, the contemporary character of Hamlet was, of course, Fortinbras, the Forte Braccio. It is the time of the end of the World War II. And for the Russian film, for Kozintsev, who created the Russian film, the contemporary character in Hamlet, with this kind of the mirror changing always with the time, was Claudius, Claudius as the image of Stalin. At this time, in the great Bolshoi theater in Moscow, was a great performance of Macbeth. And in one scene in which Lady Macbeth came down on stage, facing the audience, with her red hand soaked in blood, the audience was frightened. It was this kind of this silence, like the thunderstorm, because for the audience this image of Lady Macbeth with her hands soaked in blood was the image of Stalin. This is this kind of the realization, contemporarization, this kind of immediate effect in which Shakespeare, under these special circumstances, can have on stage. I would like now to go to some, I'm afraid, more complex situation. For me, this opposition between Wittenberg and Elsinore in Hamlet, but in some way as the symbols also in the other Shakespeare's plays, is very important for this understanding what is the contemporary one, what is not. I remember it was around 10 or 12 years ago, the spectacle of Hamlet in Dubrovnik in Yugoslavia. Dubrovnik is a beautiful resort town on the beaches and also at the same time the old town. During the summer, the festival, beaches, the people drinking, dancing, singing, making love. That's always during the summer on the resort towns. Now, near Dubrovnik is a castle, and in this castle, every time during the summer, Hamlet is performed. It was a very strange spectacle of Hamlet, because the court of Claudius and Gertrude in this production was more or less dressed like the people in the town, dancing, drinking, joyful, making love, in the modern dress. They were extremely happy. And now, in one moment, it is the ghost coming to Hamlet, and he say, "Revenge!" Now, if you imagine a beach on the Mediterranean, or the beach here in south of England during the summer, now the ghost coming, he say, "Revenge me!" to the people on beaches. The ghost is the past. The ghost is some kind of the old ideologue. Revenge, what? Holocaust, lagers, Stalin's crimes, Hitler crimes. It was a past, 20 years, 40 years, who remember? You see very well this reverse, in which the modern town, the modern life, was just the Elsinore court, and the ghost was from the past. Finally, this experience is also not very far from some spectacles in England. It was in the mid-60s. The ghost in one of the London theatres was dressed in the military coat of the World War I. Now, in some way, when I was 2 days ago in this conference of the theatrical critics, if Shakespeare is still a contemporary or not, which was exactly 25 years of the book that I wrote on Shakespeare a contemporary, I feel a little bit like a ghost coming, because 25 years, that's a very long time. And if Shakespeare, in some way, is still our contemporary, of course, it's a completely different way that Shakespeare in the 60s, with the early production by Peter Brook, later by Peter Hall, with the influence of Brecht. Of course, we have to understand the ambiguity of the influence, but with the great British critics like Kenneth Tynan, who in some way opened the English theatre to the Brecht lesson, what was very easy to see, the alienation effect, this kind of the epic understanding of the action in Shakespeare play, very closely or very tightly influenced by Brecht. It was in some way also in a much more complex way the influence of Ionesco or of Beckett, especially for the great production of King Lear by Peter Brook, also almost 25, 26 years ago, in which was the rediscovery of the fall, of the meaning of the fall, this kind of the movement from tragic into the grotesque, this bitter laughter, this understanding that the greatest theme of the King Lear is not this melodramatic or even the tragic character of the old man, but this long travel to the cold night which changed all of us into the madmen and the fools. This destruction of the world, the end of the world, this kind that the King Lear is changing into la fin de partie, into the end game, in which nothing remains, just the empty stage, in which we have the final stage direction by Shakespeare, if you remember, the funeral march. I remember it was also 10 or 12 years ago, it was a conference, I guess, in Rome on King Lear. An academic conference, mostly by scholars. In one moment when we have the intermission, and I drank a little whiskey with two of my colleagues, an Italian professor and a British professor, I asked, what is the ending of the King Lear? In a very brutal word, what is in the term of action? Or who is the next? In Macbeth, we know Macbeth will be the next king. In the other, we have always the coronation. Let's go for the new coronation. They are almost the last lines in Shakespeare tragedies. But in King Lear, who? Now my English colleague say, for any one of the English men, this is simple. Duke of Albany is still a title of the English king. Still now. That anyone in England who has some kind of the historical knowledge knows that Duke of Albany will be the next after King Lear. But my Italian colleagues say this is completely wrong. Completely wrong. Any one of the kids who has some little knowledge of Aristotle knows that in the logic of the poetics, it has to be Edgar who will be the next king after Lear. This is obvious because it's the logic of the poetry. And from Aristotle to a modern time, we know that it is the logic of the tragedy. I say you are both wrong, completely wrong. Anyone who has the experience of Poland or who spent some time of Poland knows this is the end of everything. No one will be king after the King Lear. That you see very well that is the illusion that Shakespeare is unchangeable or unchanging. A new generation of readers, any kind of the experience, of the new experience in life, not only on stage, but in audience, is changing Shakespeare and making him less or more connected with the real life and also with the real poetry and the real drama of time. One can say that with these changing images of Shakespeare, the audience could be as well in Elsinore or in Wittenberg. And the stage has to be in Elsinore or in Wittenberg or in England or in Poland, but it has to be in some place. When in the last decade, the French directors, for whom I have finally a great admiration, Madame Mouchkine in the Théâtre Soleil in Paris, make the Richards and Henrys of Shakespeare in the costume of samurais, with the techniques or the vision of kabuki. It was, of course, a masquerade. It was not the real historical time. It was Shakespeare of nowhere. It was just the opposite when the great Japanese director, Kurosawa, who did The Throne in Blood 20 years ago, and just now, 1 year ago or 2 years ago, one of the greatest Shakespeare adaptations, Ran, the adaptation of King Lear. Ran in Japanese means fury, or madness, or amok. It is to find a new historical place, a new historical time for Shakespeare. It's just the opposition of this sophistry and finally rather a theatrical aesthetics of Mushkin. It was to find a new universality of Shakespeare, a new universality of Shakespeare, a new understanding that finally the meaning, a real meaning of the King Lear is the terror. And to find a place of the terror is to find a new contemporary Shakespeare.